I sat in my old wheelchair, tucked into a bright corner of the banquet hall, when my daughter-in-law laughed and said in front of everyone, "If you want money for Dad's treatment, Mom has to crawl through here." My wife dropped to her knees. The stone floor was colder than the looks of the guests holding up their phones. My son did not stop it. He only said, "Mom, don't ruin my birthday." In that moment, I understood a bitter paradox. The poorest thing is not money, it is blood. Before this story goes any further, leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. And if you want to stay with stories like this, stories about family and truth, please subscribe and tap like. Now listen on, because what happened next is even harder to accept than what you've just heard. I stayed still in my old wheelchair, both hands resting on my thighs like someone long used to helplessness. The chandelier above poured light onto the polished stone floor, reflecting the image of my wife kneeling in front of my daughter-in-law. No one in that room looked at me. They were busy staring at their own phones, busy capturing what they called a dramatic moment. Sarah stood upright, her back straight like a statue, placed exactly where it belonged. Her evening gown did not wrinkle even a little. She slowly swirled the wine in her glass, looking at Linda, the way one looks at a stain that appeared in the wrong place. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be sharp. It was calm, frighteningly calm. She said it the way people talk about the weather. And that calmness is what silenced the entire room. Linda trembled. I could see it clearly. Her shoulders had grown thinner over the months I had been sick. She did not cry. She only lowered her head, both hands pressed close to the floor as if asking herself what else she could give in exchange for her husband's chance to live. She repeated the amount again very softly, as if afraid of disturbing the party. 150,000. That was the figure Sarah said she might consider. Then the wine glass tilted. The dark liquid spilled down Linda's shoulder. No one shouted. No one objected. A few people laughed quietly, the kind of half-believing, half-amused laugh, like they were watching a carefully staged joke. I heard a camera start recording. A small notification sound from a phone. The air in the room grew thick. David stood beside his wife. His suit fit him perfectly. His face was familiar, but his eyes were not. Those eyes were empty, measuring only the crowd's reaction. When Linda looked up at her son, I saw her hoping for something very simple. Just one sentence. Just a nod. But David avoided her gaze. He said it was his birthday party. He said no one should make things heavy. He said if money was needed, then the conditions should be accepted. I heard every word. They fell like cold stones. My wheelchair let out a very soft sound when I tightened my grip on the armrests. It was swallowed immediately by laughter and background music. No one noticed. I had been placed in a corner of the room like an old object kept out of politeness. A sick man brought in to complete the false image of a dutiful family. Linda took a very deep breath. I knew that habit well. Whenever she prepared to do something difficult, she always did that. She wiped her shoulder with her other sleeve, an awkward motion. The wine left a dark stain, but she did not care. She looked around the room at faces that were unfamiliar yet beautifully dressed. Her eyes stopped on me for just 1 second. There was no blame in that look, only an apology. I had never felt time move so slowly. Each second stretched like a question without an answer. I thought about the meals where Linda gave the best portion to our son. I thought about the evenings she counted every bill to buy David a birthday gift when he was little. Those memories did not come rushing in. They lined up quietly as if waiting their turn. Sarah stepped back 1 pace, creating space in front of her. She did it naturally, like someone used to giving orders. A few of her friends giggled. Someone whispered something, then raised their phone even higher. The party went on, but in a different way. It became a stage. I wondered when helping someone started to have a price like this, when a plea turned into a performance. I wondered if David could hear himself speaking at all, or if he had grown used to applause instead of family voices. Linda shifted her knees on the floor. She moved very slowly, as if afraid of breaking some invisible rule. I saw her back curve downward. That was the moment I realized. If I kept sitting still, some things would never return. Not money, not my personal pride, but a final boundary. Yet I stayed seated. I let everything continue for a few more breaths. Not because I was weak, but because I needed to see clearly. I needed to know how far my son would go. I needed to know how much my wife was willing to sacrifice. And I needed to know whether in that room full of light, anyone could truly see the darkness spreading. When Linda was about to lower herself further, the entire room held its breath. And in that silence I understood. This birthday party no longer belonged to David. It had become a place where long-hidden truths were laid bare. And I, the one everyone thought was the weakest, was the only one still clear-headed enough to remember everything. I watched the scene for a few more seconds, long enough to understand that this was not a sudden impulse. It was the result of many years of silence. As Linda knelt on the floor, I no longer saw the party. I saw old memories one piece at a time, stacking up and leading me back to this brightly lit room. Years ago, when David said he wanted to start his own business, I nodded almost immediately. I remember that morning clearly. There was a light rain. I signed the papers, transferring my first company into his name with a simple thought. Young people need a chance. I kept very little for myself, just enough to live. I told Linda we could move into a smaller rental house. She did not ask much. She just nodded, like she always did. In the years that followed, David's suits grew sharper. Family meals became fewer. Every time we met, he talked about numbers, about projects that sounded very big. I did not understand everything, but I believed him. I believed him because he was my son. When he asked to put the ancestral land in his name just for paperwork convenience, I did not hesitate either. That was the land my father once called our roots. I thought roots lived in people, not on paper. Then Sarah appeared. At first, she was very polite. Her words were measured, her eyes observant. I did not oppose that marriage. I only felt a very light distance, like a draft slipping through a door crack. Later, that distance grew. When we visited, Linda was often asked to help with a few small chores. I thought it was just family stuff. Until one day I heard Sarah call Linda by a name without a last name, the way someone calls hourly help. Linda did not tell me. I learned that later. She hid things well. She even hid the fact that she worked as a cleaner in the evenings. She said she was visiting a friend. I believed her. I believed her until I noticed her hands growing rougher, small cracks forming at her fingertips. She said it was the weather. I nodded. We had grown used to not asking too deeply. As for that land, I only found out it had been sold when a stranger called me asking about a moving date. I held the phone for a long time. David told me the land was tied up in planning issues impossible to keep. Selling early was better than losing everything. His voice was calm. I listened without realizing it was a carefully prepared lie. Later, I learned the money from that land had flowed into a yacht docked far away. All of this came rushing back as I looked at Linda on the floor. I realized I had confused patience with closing my eyes. I had called it trust, but it was really neglect. I had left Linda alone to carry things she never should have carried. In the banquet hall, Sarah began speaking again, as if to keep the crowd entertained. She told a light-hearted story about the difference between lending and charity. People laughed. I did not catch every word. I only saw Linda lower herself a little more. Every movement was slow, as if she feared being mistaken for resistance. David stood there, a wine glass in his hand, eyes fixed on his phone. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at me. He watched the reactions of those around him like a manager measuring the success of an event. I wondered. In his mind at that moment, where did family rank? I remembered the nights I pretended to cough more than usual. I remembered the worry in Linda's eyes, the way she squeezed my hand when she thought I was growing weaker. I did not do it to test her. I did it to watch David. I wanted to know. When there was nothing left to take what would remain, I had my answer, clearer than I ever wanted. Linda trembled again. She did not cry. That hurt me more than any sob ever could. She was used to enduring, used to staying silent to keep the peace. But this room no longer had space for peace, only for exposure. I looked around, tall walls, expensive paintings, carefully arranged chairs. Everything looked solid. Only one thing was cracking, right in front of me, and no one wanted to touch it. I wondered if I stood up right then, would anyone understand, or would they just see it as another unexpected detail to record? Linda reached her hand forward, as if to steady herself. That was the moment I knew these memories were no longer just reflections. They were pushing me out of the wheelchair little by little, not with rage, but with a cold clarity. I had seen enough. And when someone has seen enough, silence is no longer an option. Linda stopped halfway, as if an invisible thread had pulled her still. The room grew quieter than before, not out of respect, but out of anticipation. Sarah glanced at her watch, then back at Linda, impatience hidden behind a thin smile. She said she had reconsidered. Her voice was even like reading from a note. She said the money no longer made sense, that his condition was not suitable for further investment. When she finished, she leaned over and picked up a small purse from the table. I saw Linda lift her head. There was no pleading left in her eyes, only emptiness. Sarah opened the purse and poured a handful of loose bills onto the floor. The sound of them hitting the stone was sharp, louder than the music. She said that amount was enough to take care of the necessary things. Her wording was neat, precise, nothing extra. People around them chuckled softly, as if they had just watched the climax of a well-rehearsed scene. David stepped forward one pace. For a very brief second, I thought he would say something to end this, but he did not. He pulled out his phone, adjusted the angle, and started a live stream. He told the screen this was a lesson, that there were limits one should not cross. He did not say his mother's name. He did not need to. The image on the floor said everything. Linda bent down, not because of the money. I knew that. She bent down because she did not want this to drag on any longer. She picked up each bill carefully, like gathering sharp fragments that could cut her hands. I saw her back tremble slightly. No one stepped forward. No one stopped it. The people who had just wished David a happy birthday now stood silent, focused on their own screens. I felt my breathing grow heavier. The wheelchair beneath my hands suddenly felt unfamiliar. I thought about all the times I chose silence to keep the peace. All the times I told myself things would work out. And I understood. If I stayed seated, I would become part of this in a way I could never undo. I placed my hands on the floor and pushed myself up. My knees shook a little, but not from weakness. The room stirred. Someone muttered something. Someone turned off their phone. David looked at me, for the first time that night. Confusion flickered in his eyes, then quickly disappeared. I walked toward Linda. Each step was deliberate. I bent down beside her. I said nothing. I simply placed my hand on her shoulder. I wiped the dried wine stain away slowly, like smoothing out a crease in clothing. Linda looked up at me. She tried to speak, but I shook my head. No words were needed now. I turned to David. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I only said that once certain things are turned into entertainment, there is no way back. I said that wealth, when used only to hide emptiness, will eventually collapse on itself. I called him by name. The room fell completely silent. Sarah let out a short laugh. She said I should return to my seat, that I was making things uncomfortable. I looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, but with final judgment. I realized she had never seen us as family. We were just part of a backdrop she could rearrange. David ended the live stream. I saw his hand shake as he did it. He said I was overreacting, that everything could be handled privately. I shook my head. I said what happened here was already public, and once something is public, there is no such thing as private anymore. Linda stood up, leaning against me. She felt lighter than I expected. I thought about the years she carried things for me that I never saw. I thought about how I owed her clarity. I looked back at the room, every face, every averted gaze. I said, this party did not need to continue, not because of me, but because it had gone too far beyond anything deserving respect. No one applauded. No one argued. This silence was different. It was no longer curious. It was heavy. I knew that from the moment I stood up, everything had crossed a breaking point. Not a loud collapse, but a crack that could never be sealed with late apologies. I helped Linda walk a few steps. Behind us, I heard Sarah say something to David, her voice low. I did not turn back. I did not need to hear it. What needed to be exposed had been exposed. What needed to fall silent had fallen silent. And in that moment, I understood. People do not lose their family in a single night. They lose it through small choices, one by one, until there is nothing left to hold on to. I did not walk fast. I did not stop either. I simply supported Linda for a few more steps, just enough to move away from the center of the room. Behind us, no one tried to stop us, not out of respect, but because they were waiting to see what would happen next. I could feel that clearly. The curiosity was still there. It had only changed direction. Just as we stopped near the large glass doors facing the garden, I heard a familiar sound, the roll of wheels on gravel, not my wheelchair. From outside, black cars entered the driveway one by one. They were quiet. No horns. No rush. They appeared as if arranged in advance, at exactly the right moment. Sarah turned first. The smile on her lips slowed. David looked out as well. I saw him frown as if trying to remember whether he had invited anyone like this. The other guests began to whisper. A party built on control had suddenly lost its rhythm. The main doors opened. There was no noise. Just a few men walking in, dressed more simply than what this room was used to seeing. They did not look around. They walked straight toward me. When the man in front stopped, he gave a slight nod. "Sir," he said quietly. "Just one word." But the room changed instantly. Sarah fully turned around. She looked at me then, at the men, her expression shifting from irritation to calculation. David stepped forward and said this was a private event. One of the men handed him a business card. David took it, glanced at it, then froze. I saw his shoulders tense. I kept my hand on Linda's shoulder. I told her we did not need to go anywhere. She looked at me surprised. I nodded. She understood. She was used to me not saying much. I turned to David. I said it was time to end the performances. I said that wheelchair had only been part of the waiting, not to test sympathy, but to see choices clearly. I said the debts, the numbers he thought he controlled, were actually being held by the people standing in front of him. No one in the room spoke. Sarah stepped forward and said this was intimidation. She said her family was not easily shaken. One of the men calmly placed a folder on the table. He did not explain much. He only said everything was complete. Very clean words. David opened the folder. I did not need to look to know what he saw. I had seen it long before. Signatures, timelines, clauses he had never read carefully because he believed he was above them. His hand trembled. He tried to stay calm, but I knew this was the first time he felt the ground beneath him give way. Sarah made a phone call. She stepped aside. At first, her voice was confident. Then it dropped. Then it stopped. When she turned back, her face was no longer sharp. She asked me something. I did not answer, not out of contempt, but because no answer mattered anymore. I told David I was not taking back what I had given. I was only ending my protection. I said what came next was not punishment. It was consequence. Consequences he had delayed by pushing them onto others, onto his mother, onto those weaker than him. Linda tightened her grip on my hand. I knew she was shaking, not from fear, but because everything was happening too fast. I leaned in and told her things would be okay. Not the old way, the right way. One of the men added a few words about temporarily freezing certain management rights. No heavy language. None was needed. The room already understood. Guests began to quietly gather their things. No phones raised, no laughter. David stood in the middle of the room like someone whose stage lights had just gone out. He looked at me again, this time without defenses. He asked why. I said I had given him enough time to stop on his own. He did not. And when someone does not know how to stop, eventually they are stopped. Sarah stood beside him, silent. For the first time I saw her say nothing, not because of regret, but because there was no longer a place to stand above. I took Linda's hand and walked outside. No one followed. None was needed. The air outside was cooler. I took a long breath, not to release anything, but to confirm that what had just happened was real. Behind us, the party ended in a way no one had planned. No breaking sounds, no chaos, just a very clean closing. And I knew, for David and Sarah, this was not the end of their story. But for Linda and me, this was the moment we stepped out of our final role. We sat in the car for a long while without speaking. Linda leaned back against the seat, her hands resting neatly on her lap. I looked out the window and watched the rows of trees drift slowly past. When the noise of the party was far behind us, I realized my breathing had evened out. Not relief. Stability. The feeling came late, but it was real. Linda spoke first. She asked if I was tired. I shook my head. She asked if I regretted it. I thought for a moment, then said, if I did, it was only that I had waited too long. Linda held my hand very gently. She did not say anything else. We understood each other without explanation. A few days later, I sent David a letter. Not to argue, not to accuse. Inside were only basic documents and an old birth certificate. I wrote one short line in slow, careful handwriting. I gave you life. The rest is your choice. No blame, no conditions. I knew those simple words would say more than any conversation ever could. I did not meet Sarah again. That was not avoidance. It simply was not necessary. What needed to be exposed was already done. I was not seeking acknowledgement or apology. I chose silence, because silence at that point was the healthiest boundary. Linda and I returned to the small house we had lived in for years. On the first evening, she cooked a simple meal. I washed the dishes. Everything felt familiar except the heaviness was gone. We ate slowly. No television. Only the soft sound of spoons touching bowls. A week later, I completed the final paperwork for a fund I had long planned. I named it Dignity for Elders. No publicity. No launch event. Just a way to redirect what I once thought I would leave to my son, toward a place that could protect the dignity of people who had lived long enough to know what it means to be ignored in silence. Linda joined me. She said she wanted to help in her own way. I nodded. No long discussion needed. We started small. A few community rooms. A few support packages for elderly people living alone. Every time we visited, Linda talked with them for a long time. I sat and listened. I realized her gentleness carried a kind of healing that money could never buy. Sometimes I think about David, not with anger, but with a clear, quiet sadness. I know his road will be difficult, but it is a road he must walk himself. I do not turn back to pull him forward. Not because I do not love him, but because I understand that some lessons only arrive when no one is left shielding you. One afternoon, Linda and I went to the beach. The sun was gentle. The wind was just enough. We sat on a wooden bench, watching the waves come and go. Linda said she felt lighter. So did I. Not because everything had been perfectly resolved, but because we no longer had to perform. I thought about the wheelchair left in the corner of that banquet hall. It had fulfilled its role. I did not hate it. I did not take it with me. Everything has its time, and when that time passes, letting go is the right thing to do. Linda leaned her shoulder against mine. I placed my hand over hers. No one spoke about the past. No one spoke about a distant future. We were simply there, in the present moment, calm enough to hear the waves, clear enough to know we had chosen correctly. This story does not end with loud victory. It ends with one door closing and another path opening. A path that does not need to prove anything to anyone, only to preserve what matters most, dignity and peace when looking back at oneself. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If what you heard made you slow down for a moment, think about family silence boundaries and dignity, then this story has done its job. If you saw a part of yourself in these choices, please tap like, subscribe, and share so this story can reach more people. Because sometimes the lesson is not about how much money or power we keep, but whether we dare to hold on to self-respect, kindness, and humanity. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And I hope we meet again in the next story.